Welcome to Optimized for Humans. My name is Usha. I'm an executive coach and consultant and the host of this podcast where we explore the AI adoption disruption that's happening in our world right now and how we can actually make the most of our human creativity and innovation and all the great things that come with human and strategically outsource the rest to AI. Today, I am speaking with Andy Hagerman, who's the co-founder of The Design Gym, a strategy, culture, and change consultancy focused on unlocking the secret ingredient of every organization, the power of its people. Andy, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much, Usha.
We've had a brief conversation, kind of in the lead up to this, and I'm really excited to sort of pick your brain around, what adaptivity means in organizations, in our world right now, because I know that's one of the specialties of the Design Gym and the work that you do of really helping organizations be more adaptive and be more responsive to the forces of the market, et cetera. And I'd love to start by asking, what does adaptive mean to you and why is it important?
Yeah, totally. I think in its simplest forms, we think about this notion of adaptive leadership as the ability of a leader to mobilize a group of people, often a kind of complex group of people, around a shared challenge. And to me, that is kind of like the basic definition of leadership. You hear that and you're like, oh, doesn't sound too different than how I've heard about leadership or learned about it. But I think the final piece there is particularly amidst really complex moments in time. And I think that summarizes what pretty much every organization is in the middle of right now, whether that's the economic forces at play, whether that's talent challenges, retention challenges, competitive threats. A lot of organizations are still facing the recovery from COVID and kind of the transitions that come out of that crises, or there's organizations that are facing massive growth right now as well. And that's another form of complexity that shows up. But either way, how you slice it and dice it, it's putting a lot of pressure on the way works right now and the way leaders lead. And it's an interesting moment that we're finding that it's calling for new models of both of those things to really shift how work happens. And that's where we've been spending a lot of our time on this topic of adaptive leadership and adaptive teaming.
Awesome. And there's also lots of like misconceptions when it comes to what being adaptive means. And I'd love for you to unpack some of that.
Yeah. It's a really dynamic time right now in this topic. And I think my passion for this topic really shows up in the work that we've been doing over the last 15 years with organizations. At this moment feels notably different. And the clients we talk to, big, small, domestic, global, there's just a felt sense of kind of tiredness within organizations right now, this kind of languishing. And I really deeply believe that it's going to be kind of a crisis on workforce and the way work gets done, except for the organizations that choose to step back and acknowledge that and ask the hard questions about how change can happen differently and what changes need to happen in the way we work. So that's kind of the abstract version. I think how it's like really concretely showing up is that there's a lot of data on this now, but the prevalence of loneliness in the workplace is definitely on the rise. And we see that a lot as we talk to particularly kind of the manager, director levels in organizations where they're hearing these drastic mandates from the top to accomplish a lot, to move faster, to do it all with less resources and cut teams. But very little prioritization that's kind of coming off of their plates. So the goals and the ambitions of the organizations, I don't necessarily fault them because I think, you need to keep moving through moments of complexity. You can't just stagnate. But at the same time, a lot of that pressure is just coming down to sit in the middle levels of leadership and the middle levels of the organization. And that burnout and loneliness is really taking hold in a way that I think is going to have a drastic impact on companies. The second, I guess, big like leading indicator that we're paying a lot of attention to is just this notion of doing more with less. And the way that we like to talk about it is the words agility and the words adaptability, they become so buzzy at this point. They're getting thrown around left and right. and they're being misused in really substantial ways. So there's a lot of leadership teams who are saying we're going to become a more agile organization, or we need to become more adaptive. But the only thing that's actually shifting is we've doubled our goals, we've cut our resources in half, and we're putting all that down into the organization and expecting it to achieve what we want. And it's not working, is the spoiler alert. So, that notion of the misuse of agility, I think, is really starting to fall apart. Employees are saying, we're not actually being agile. This is just actually chaos, masked as agility. And I think that tension is really starting to get challenged in a positive way. Because I think leaders need to start taking more accountability for those words, those very important words that they're talking about. And that's where a lot of kind of the work that we focus on is like, so what does adaptability actually mean in practice beyond just these kind of buzzy words or workshops that are getting tossed around?
Yeah, gosh, there's so much in that I want to dig into. The first piece, that this whole notion of like doing more with less.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a part about it that I like, and there's a part about it that I bristle against. And the thing that I like is very much my software agrees. The thing that I like is very much thinking in new ways about how something gets done, and
Mm-hmm.
figuring out ways to be creative and get there in new ways. And I really like that. I like the notion of challenging ourselves in that way. The thing that I bristle against is it feels often like code for, I want you to work longer hours and I just want you to get it done. We're going to cut two people from our team, but we're going to maintain the full workload of our team. And, the rest of us just have to like figure it out. And it's been an interesting observation for me, kind of being in this like insider outsider role, having been not living in the States for the last 5 years or so, and kind of watching from the outside in some ways, and now kind of being immersed in it. And the thing that I've noticed is the pandemic happened, and then there's this huge reshuffling. And from what I could tell, a lot of organizations have actually acknowledged like the need for well-being, the need for flexibility. And from, again, as an outsider's perspective, like it seemed like in the States, and certainly in my experience in other organizations outside of the States, is we did get better at prioritizing. We got really good at like, what are the most important and impactful things right now? And I feel like we've really let that muscle go over the
Mm.
last 5 years, and really shifted back to, okay, now we're going to do all of the things, and we're going to figure out how to do it with less. And the part that I think I bristle against the most with that is, because this is a knowledge economy, I don't think the input, like in terms of hours, is equal to output in terms of impact.
Yeah.
Um, and I actually think we're losing more of the impact and growth that we're wanting to have by pushing in this way. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where that push, and like it almost just feels like this contraction,
Mm-hmm.
where you think it's coming from.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors at play. I mean, I think the dominant root cause that I pay a lot of attention to is actually still from COVID, honestly. And which might be a surprising answer. There's a lot of factors going on, but that one, I think a lot of organizations are saying, oh, it's 5 years in. Generally, we've resolved past that. It's time to move forward. But I still believe there's a drastic organizational hangover that's existing from that. And I think to piggyback on what you're mentioning, I think there was a really amazing moment of prioritization and focus that the pandemic forced upon most organizations. And it was remarkable to see how so many massive organizations moved faster, more quickly, with higher engagement, with sustained talent than ever before. And that's like, it's really remarkable. But that's a survivor mindset. It's a survivor mentality, and it's a crisis response mentality, and that's not sustainable. So there's a lot of organizations I see today, particularly ones that had outsized roles during the pandemic. So you're thinking like retailers, we're thinking grocery stores, certainly doctors and healthcare systems, pharmaceutical companies. That survivor mindset is still very alive and well, and it's dictating a lot of the way work gets done. And we're seeing that lead to a lot of burnout because you can operate like that in a short crisis response moment, but it's not a way 5 years later to try and to operate your organization. So I believe that combined with the outsized goals and expectations that a lot of organizations are putting on themselves now, they're trying to achieve incredible outcomes on the backs of a broken workforce. And that's just a recipe for disaster. So I think that's something I'm paying a lot of attention to. The other side of that, to what you were mentioning, is this notion of chaos. And I think that's something that we really are seeing a lot. And there's a tension or contradiction that exists where I think a lot of leaders are saying, just manage the complexity, manage the chaos. There's all these factors that are forcing us from competitive threats to pricing to cost of living to administration changes. Just we need to ride through it. So be agile, But in my belief, and this is something we talk a lot with our client organizations around, is like agility requires stability. And agility without stability is just chaos. And that is not a way to run a functioning, high-performing business. So over time, at least. So a lot of what we talk to leaders about, and it takes a really brave leader, honestly, to be able to slow down in a moment where everything is speeding up and to say, like, where are the parts of our organization where we can try to inject more clarity and stability and ownership, even if that's going to change in 2 weeks or 3 months or 5 months, it probably will. But can we control that within this moment so that our employees and our leaders themselves have some stable foundation to stand upon so that we actually can be agile and nimble on some of the unexpected complexities that are facing us? And AI is just the perfect kind of breeding ground for all of these challenges because it is this, 10,000 foot wave that is just barreling towards all organizations. So I think in a lot of ways, it is just like putting a magnifying glass on some of those bad behaviors that are happening. And the organizations that are truly stepping back to slow down and think more strategically, I think are the ones that are winning in it. And we're going to see that really profoundly over the next couple of years in terms of impact and growth.
Yeah, the picture that I'm kind of seeing form, hearing you speak, is there's a real kind of there's that misconception of what agility means that feels and looks a little bit like just figure it out, do more with less, like piling on. And it's almost like a resignation into the chaos
Yeah.
rather than like a really thoughtful resolution of it, of like pivoting in the storm of like, all right, this is what's coming at us. This is where we need to go. What does that mean? And what are all the levers in which we can pull in a strategic way to move forward, which is really the kind of agility that I think we both champion and teach in organizations, right? But it does feel like it's becoming this buzzword of just like, deal with it.
It's silver bullet thinking. Yeah, which is very dangerous. Yeah, as soon as you start trying to find a silver bullet to say like, oh, we're under a lot right now, it's really easy to latch on to a word. And I don't even, it's not a bad word. The essence of agility and adaptability is 100% right, I think. And there's a lot of great research and books that are on these topics that are totally well grounded and founded and organizations that have made good use of them. But for the leaders who are grabbing those words and latching onto them without a lot of thinking about the structural, systemic, behavioral shifts that are required to come along with that, that's where, a real risk happens. And unfortunately, I think the leaders are the ones in the middle of the organization are the ones that end up taking the brunt of that.
Yeah. And it's interesting. Like there's this ironic piece of like, there's almost this, it feels to me in some ways like the opposite of agility because it feels like a doubling down of just keep doing more, just keep working harder and we'll get there, rather than strategically pivoting and responding to what's happening in the moment. I'm also really struck by what you shared about that survival mode piece. Because the image that had formed for me in that is we, in COVID, we went into that kind of survival mode of just doing things differently to make something happen. And we're in this real peak as part of that. And then the valley never came.
Yeah.
The peak just maybe fell a little bit and then we just plateaued. But it almost felt like this, like, oh, this is what's possible. So let's just stretch it all. And even with the whole kind of return to office mandates and stuff, there's so much that I'm fascinated by in that, because it feels it feels a little bit like come back to the office because your presence makes a difference and that's how we know you're being productive, working, etc. And I expect you to be online at 7 a.m.
Yeah.
And I expect you to be online at 7 p.m. And it's just like extended everything rather than recalibrated in a
Yeah.
meaningful way. And none of that is to, I have strong feelings about this whole return to office mandate in a way that's like haphazard of just like a number of days, etc., rather than like for meaningful moments. But not to rag on that too much, but there's just this lack of like strategic intent, and it
Yeah.
feels like a lot of I don't know, it just feels punishing to me at this moment.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's the intention. I think a lot of this to me feels like a response to scarcity, especially in an environment I don't know what all the official definitions are, but it seems like we are in a recession right now.
Yeah.
Um, there's lots of movement in the job market.
Hmm.
And I know the official unemployment rate still seems low, but there's like large swaths of people who are being let go. And I'm definitely in my own life seeing the impact of that on a number of people. And the people I've spoken with, have also like we're feeling the contraction, and it seems like our response is more fear and more pushing, and even for employees feeling like, well, I have to prove myself because come time for cuts, I want to make sure I'm invaluable.
Hmm.
But I just don't know that that's serving anyone right now. And I also I'm curious what some solutions might be to come
Yeah.
out of that fear.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's two things that I've been thinking a lot about on this topic, and I totally agree. I mean, whether you classify this as a recession or not, like the energy feels very distinct. It feels unproductive, and I think we're seeing that in um, the engagement scores and things like that are coming out. That I think it's like there's a felt sense of employees are caring less about the work, or they're not as engaged in it. And I think there's a real hesitancy in organizations to be betting big or setting priorities because they don't know. I was talking to a CHRO the other day, and she was like, I don't know how to plan for 2026. Like, I know if I lay out my next 12-month plan and budget, it's going to be scrapped within 2 months, and I know that for a fact. So how do I even think about this? Which there's lots to reflect on there, but I think it's a symbolic of what I think a lot of organizations are facing is like they know they need to keep moving forward, but they also know their planning processes that have worked for them for decades, air quotes, aren't going to serve them in this moment. They don't know how to kind of move past that. Um, Anyways, there's two specific things I think a lot about is the impact of that survivor mindset is I was doing a keynote a couple weeks ago and dug into the research on this, which I found fascinating is essentially what is getting triggered is that classic like human instinct of fight or flight, and we're in this moment in a survival moment that naturally comes on. And I very much believe that happens at an organizational level as well, which is what allowed so many organizations to clarify focus and, roll up their sleeves and muscle through a really, really tough time. But what happens when that fight or flight gets kicked in, at a kind of behavioral and brain science level is that we're really shutting down a lot of aspects of our brain that are required for creative, innovative, effective teamwork. And that's our ability to do critical thinking. We tend to snap back to kind of simplified heuristics and frameworks, things that we've seen before, we've known before. It really limits our ability for creative thinking. It limits our ability for navigating tension with peers and coworkers. And those are all things that are absolutely required right now to achieve the goals that most organizations are asking for. So if our managers in particular, our directors are still operating with that fight or flight pressure on our brains, it's actually hindering. We're not able to show up at work every day with the skill sets that are needed to accomplish the goals that are in front of us. And I think that's a big reason why we're seeing a lot of that. And it just takes a brave leadership team to say, cool, how do we snap our organization out of that mindset? And I think name it really clearly. But then the element of like really ruthless prioritization is shortly after that in my mind, is being confident enough as a leader to take things off of the docket and say, here's the 1, 2, or 3 things that we're really going to go deep on. And here's the things we're not going to focus on, even though we know they're important and there's a lot of risks around us. I think that clarified sense of where are we going and the specificity of here's how you plug into it is a missing gap that I'm seeing in most organizations today. The second big trend beyond like the fight or flight is the tension between engagement and outcomes. And I think that directly plays to it, where it might sound like I'm pessimistic on all this, but I'm actually like wildly optimistic in this moment. And I always joke, like I've got a bookshelf, there's, decades worth of books talking about organizational design and development and like, we need to change the way we work. And they're all these amazing bodies of research with tons of great ideas that have never really been adopted at scale within the most powerful organizations in the world. So like, where is that breakdown? I don't think up until this moment, there's been a good enough business case to disrupt the way of working. Yes, we could be working better, but like, is it worth that disruption to risk, the growth trajectory we've been on? That's not the case we're in right now. There's way too many factors, whether it's AI or remote work or the economy or the polarization of culture and society. There's too many factors right now that are actually forcing the hand and are opening the door, honestly, for these new ways of working, no longer as a nice to have, but as an absolute mandate. And that, to me, both of us as the work that we do, is super exciting. Like, it's actually creating this moment where change is required. And if the organizations can embrace that effectively, it's actually a beautiful moment to like think about how we could be doing work different and what's possible if we let go of some of those older ways of working. And AI is just like a foundational tool, super force that is going to allow that to amplify for the companies that approach it right.
Yeah, I'm really struck by the example of the CHR that you mentioned of like, how do we even plan for 2026?
Yeah.
And I imagine a lot of leaders will be actually in a similar boat, because it has been so disrupted that our ability to forecast and imagine is just getting, it's less and less useful,
Yeah.
right? And yeah, I'm really struck by the optimism as well. And I share in that. I think there actually is massive opportunity. And I think it's also forcing the hand in terms of like abandoning this old way of working that actually really doesn't serve a knowledge economy and more, dare I say, an AI economy. I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know if
Yeah.
that's true, but I think there's this huge piece of like AI can and likely should take over a lot of the tasks within organizations. And what does that mean? What does that look like? How do you change your operating model from
Yeah.
that perspective? And what does that free up your humans to do? And how can you actually leverage that to address some of the burnout and to free up some of the creative capacity,
Yeah.
and the innovation capacity and the empathetic capacity? What does all of that mean? What does that look like from an engagement perspective and from an outcome perspective? And an impact perspective. I think there's some like really meaningful strategic questions to reimagine, that could get us out of this hole where people are just burnt out right now. And it's interesting you spoke about like fight or flight, and I really resonate with that. I think that is actually exactly what we've been in, which is like COVID happened. We were kind of into that peak of like operating at fight or flight, and we've never quite come down from that fully.
Yeah.
And all the kind of research around nervous systems and whatnot shows that actually like sustained adrenaline and sustained cortisol in fight or flight is so corrosive to the human
Yeah.
body, and I don't think that's just like a problem at the individual or like an employee well-being level. I think that's corrosive for the organization's ability to meet its purpose as well. I think it corrodes the ability to be creative, the ability to be empathetic. I know when I'm stressed, I have less patience.
Yeah.
And how is that showing up in the politics of an organization, right?
Yeah.
I think there's actually much far greater impact with all of these things than we're maybe paying attention to
Yeah.
as leaders within the organization. And speaking of leaders, I leadership just feels really hard right now, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that. What are your, this is definitely what I'm seeing in the leaders I've been working with, and I'm just curious what you're noticing.
Yeah. Yes, it's a good segue because that was like the final note I wanted to make, which is to this point is like for anyone listening, like I don't want it to sound like it's kind of this outside perspective and like boohoo on you for being a bad leader or not doing a good job prioritizing. My
Mhm.
optimism is should not be confused with the sense that this is easy, and I think that's the transitions, the changes, the complexity that we're navigating right now is unprecedented in my mind. And it is extremely, extremely difficult. And I say that as a small business owner who absolutely is still operating with a survivor mindset, trying to navigate through the pandemic years. It's like that's still ingrained in me where it's, let's just put my head down and work harder and try to control this really hard situation. And that's what'll get me through because that's what's gotten me through in the past. That's the wrong mindset. So I think, it is a hard moment to be a leader right now. And what I've found, I was doing a keynote for a group last week and talking about this notion of adaptive leadership. And one of the first things I mentioned is I was like, hey, like, if you're sensing that it feels hard right now, it's because it is hard. And I just want to name that for you. And it was amazing. I looked around 150 leaders and it was like this collective, like, sigh. It's just like, oh my gosh, someone finally named it. It's not just me. And I'm like, yeah, and I'm seeing this at all of my clients everywhere right now. And like, oh my gosh, it's everyone's trying to navigate this, and it's like, I really truly believe that is the first low barrier step that an organization can take is just naming it and saying, whew, this is a hard moment to be a leader. This is a hard moment to be a company. Many of you are probably wondering where the grass is greener and like how we could make this feel a little bit better. Let's just acknowledge this moment we're in. And I think that can go so far and open the door for a whole new dynamic of leadership, collaborative problem solving that I think is, for me, like really at the core of adaptive systems when it comes to organizations is how do you open these really wild challenges up to a broader swath of your leaders to be getting listening from different parts of the organization, to be really vulnerable that you as the executive team or the CEO or the head of your business unit don't have all the answers, and being really open about that, but get really freaking good at framing problems that need to be solved and understanding who's the best team around the table to help you kind of navigate that with. Like those are the radical shifts from um, prior leadership models that aren't rocket science. They're not new. Like there's always been leaders who have operated in that way, but I think the mandate for that better version of leadership or that evolved version of leadership, which I think we're calling adaptive leadership, is just much more required now to survive in this era without burning out.
Yeah, I feel really kind of excited and energized hearing you speak about that because on the one hand, I think these are the skills that humans are uniquely capable of.
Yeah.
Navigating through uncertainty together, we are uniquely good at.
Yeah.
And I think the pandemic is like a huge shining example of that. Like we figured it out, and of course, some decisions were better than others, but we rallied. I mean, the notion even just, like if 7 years ago someone came to you and said there will be no flying or like, the number of flights in the air will go down from some, 100% to like 10%,
Mm-hmm.
you would have said that's crazy. How can I possibly run my business? How can we possibly run the world with that kind of a constraint? And yet we made it happen. And that's just like one tiny example of like a much bigger phenomenon. And I think this moment is actually really calling on us to step into more of that.
Yeah.
And it's breaking apart this old narrative of leadership and this whole notion of like hero leadership, right? Of like,
Yeah.
as a leader, I am responsible, I am accountable, I am supposed to have all the answers. I am supposed to chart the way forward and tell people what to do. And then the people's role is to just go do the thing I tell them to do, right?
Yeah.
I lead, they follow. I am the hero, and then, there's like a cast of characters supporting the hero. And it's really breaking through that kind of that framework because it doesn't work anymore in an uncertain world. That works great in a predictable certain world where there's a clear, point A and clear point B and a clear path between A and B.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited about that potential. And I appreciate the empathy towards leaders. And I kind of wanted to also just say, like, the thing that really stands out to me, especially working with so many kind of senior and executive leaders, is they are not set up for success. Like, this
Yeah.
is, they often go from like meeting to meeting. They're constantly mode switching.
They're
They
feeling
get
it too.
work done. Yeah, they get work done after hours.
Hmm.
And this whole notion where I think many of us say like, oh, you need to be more strategic as a leader, you need to like step back, reflect. And there's this whole question of like, when exactly would you like me to do that?
Yeah. Yeah.
They're being pulled into all kinds of decisions, etc. And it's actually the way the system is set up. It's no one person's or no one individual's desire or fault. It's the way we've done things in the past, and we haven't quite disrupted that in a meaningful way yet across most kind of traditional organizations. I know there's different organizations trying that out, but I think the optimism is that this is a huge moment to actually, that's forcing our hand to disrupt that
I
and to
think that's right.
reimagine what that looks like, what leading in that kind of adaptive way looks like, and for the organization to be adaptive, like to have adaptive as part of the core operating system. And that's my next question. And my final question to you is, what does that look like in an ideal world, an organization that's humming and is adaptive across its operating system? What are you seeing? What are you feeling? What are you noticing?
Yeah, totally. So there's it's a really interesting moment where I totally agree that the executives are also feeling this in all the same ways. And I do believe, as much as I believe in some good grassroots org change, like I think that executive level are the ones who have the unique power and ability to change that dynamic. And I think that's where the responsibility comes on them. So there's a lot of talk right now around like, what does a courageous leader look like? What does a brave leader look like? And I think that's what it's really pinpointing is like, do you have the ability to remove yourself from the chaos that is happening and say, what is the better path we can take? How do we create just a little bit more time or slack or space to acknowledge this together so that we can move 1 or 2 percentage points to the right or the left to do this in a more effective way? And I think that's really where it starts is executive leaders or even like functional leaders who have enough authority to create that space to step out and challenge the way it's been done and start to open up new ways of doing it. So those are the leaders we look for. I think they're the ones that are going to actually leapfrog competitors in the coming years, because as AI gets adopted faster, like it's not going to be the new technology or the next big idea. It's going to be their ability to galvanize their people around really shared priorities and perform against them, which is like really the differentiator in performance that we're seeing these days. So anyways, when we find those leaders, something we've been thinking a lot about is like, so how do you give them guidance or vision on what this new way of working looks like? Because there's a lot of great kind of abstract philosophical or academic thinking on how org design could look and feel differently that often ends with like, just go try it, and I don't believe personally that that's concrete enough for most leaders to make that leap of like, cool, but what does it look like in practice? Like at the same time, it's not just a checklist activity where it's not a sense of like, here's the 5 steps you can take to be more adaptive. And in 3 months from now, you'll be moving faster with less resources and your employees will be much happier. Like that's not reality either. So we've been trying to thread the balance of like walking that tension where it's not one extreme or the other. And I do think that most leaders need some sense of a playbook to guide them and a clear set of principles that helps them understand like, how do I approach leadership different on a day-to-day basis than I might have in the past? So we've been building out what we call the adaptive operating system. And it's this set of shared foundations that leaders, even amidst the most complex times, do have the ability to stabilize and create control over, even though you can acknowledge it's going to shift. It's definitely going to continue to change, but being able to create that stability for your employees and your team is what's going to allow them to then be adaptive to the complexities and the curveballs that come away. So some of the things that are included in there, things like a really clear mission and what we call team charter. So understanding like what is the mandate of the organization right now, whether that's performance, growth, retention, competitive threat, turnaround, um, understanding that organizational mandate, and then understanding what is the role that our team plays within that. Again, this isn't rockets. This is like leadership 101, but we've come so far away from it that it really takes a certain brave leader to like step back and re-clarify that for their team. Things like decision-making rights is like, it's shocking to me how much of a breakage point this is within teams that's showing up. But being able to clarify that and get really hyper specific, documenting like who and how decisions get made against certain topics is a big friction point that is extremely ownable and controllable, but is creating a lot of burn within most organizations. AI kind of workflows and use cases is another part of this adaptive OS that we're talking about. And this is where I'm sure you're seeing, and I've heard about it on your podcast, is like there's a lot of churn in the AI rollout right now because it's a lot of organizations saying, cool, we bought you the license. Now go experiment with it on your own time, with your own wherewithal. And by the way, we're not going to tell you what the impact on your job might be 6 months from now. And like employees are like, cool, I was excited about AI, but now I'm terrified because I have no idea where I'm going to find time to do this or what the outcome is going to look like. And that's creating a massive waste, honestly. It's a very low ROI on a lot of AI kind of adoption, culture change programs that are happening, which I think is going to become much more obvious for organizations over the next year, where they're like, oh, that way of doing it is not working. We created a lot of buzz. We created some fear. What's the other path? And this is where getting more defined at a team level about, and this, again, it's a leadership responsibility to say, like, what are the really specific use cases, workflows, and type of value that we want to create or think we could create with AI? And then how do we create thoughtful experiments to test our way into that, to actually validate those experiments and also learn along the way about like what feels good and what doesn't, like what does good ethical or responsible AI adoption look like at a team level? And no one's an expert on AI. If they tell you they're an expert on AI, they're lying to you. Like we're all trying to figure this out together. And it takes a leader to be able to like invite their team into that experimentation and create a learning curve for them. So those are some examples of kind of the AOS as we think about it. But the biggest shift underpinning all of that is it is a new philosophy of leadership that I think is required. And it's very different than management. It's not controllable. It's not technical tasks that you're saying like, do this, check this box, create this outcome. It is this ongoing fluid process where a leader every single day when they wake up, they're saying, cool, like how has the mandate changed? Therefore, how has our mission changed? What did we learn about those AI tests? And they're kind of a conductor in this beautiful orchestra that can feel really fun and it can feel very fluid and co-creative, or it can feel terrifying and overwhelming. It's just a matter of that mindset shift that takes place from, prescriptive to adaptive.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much richness in that. And the thing that really stands out to me is that shift from like trying to predict and control
Yeah.
to like that sensing and responding mindset, right? And actually, I think this whole notion of like you need more clarity, not less, in times of chaos, right?
Yeah.
Or in times of change. So actually leveraging things like team charter and being more and more explicit about this is what we're trying to achieve in the short term and in the long term, and how every single purpose of every other team ladders into this. Like that aligning work, I think, is actually the most important for leaders across the organization. And then
Yeah.
there's this notion of just like freeing that up and then saying, all right, team, like now here's how we fit into that puzzle. What does that mean for us? And how are we going to move and change and create from that place? And I
Yeah.
think especially from an AI adoption perspective, that's brilliant to actually have that be, it's like local change and local innovation that can spread and be, a learning opportunity, etc. And we really, I think, traditionally in organizations, there's this kind of way of working that's all about like policies and
Yeah.
rollouts, and it's like, here's a thing and here's how we want you to use it and this is what we want you to do, rather than the kind of, here's the problem we're trying to solve as a team, here are all the tools available to us, what do we as the team of humans, how do we want to leverage all of this, and what do we want to create, and how does that ladder up and how does that ladder down, and
Yeah.
what does that look like? So it's a very different way of operating and moving. But it's also like very in line with living systems. That's how living systems operate. They're
Exactly.
constantly moving, adapting, changing, and they have a clear kind of purpose or mandate, and then we all self-organize around it, right? So this is actually in our bones. This is a part of our fabric as humans. We're wired to do this. And in some ways it feels like we can stop fighting so hard against our kind of inner nature to try and fit into this like rules and control and step into something different. I just think it takes a lot of courage for leaders to enable that, to welcome that, and invite that.
Yeah,
When so much of our kind of organizational DNA has been anchored around control.
absolutely. Yeah, you framed it up perfect. I mean, the environment is like the perfect metaphor for all of this. And it is a lot of like self-sabotage and ego and societal pressures to act and perform a certain way. And also like actual systems of like performance and compensation and job descriptions that will need to get adjusted in this movement as well, so that folks are given the freedom to be based on how they experiment or how they encourage learning, as opposed to, were you the leader that hit this goal and had the answers for us quarter over quarter, which is generally how most organizations are kind of measured these days. So there's definitely, like, not to undersell some of the systemic systems that need to be adjusted in this journey as well.
Andy, I want to close out with sort of on a practical note of like, for a leader out there who's listening to us, what's one thing we would suggest that they do today or tomorrow to start moving in this more adaptive direction? I'd love to hear from you first.
Yeah, it's a good question. The first thing that came up to me is like the mindset shift. I really believe a lot of this change towards a more adaptive organization happens one leader at a time, and it happens at a deeply personal level of like, am I willing and able to let go of former perceptions of what leadership is and how I should be performing and what I should look like, and be doing? Like, am I willing to let some of that go and to embrace some of these new principles? That's hard to do, though. I can't just say like, oh, have a mindset shift, and you're like, oh gosh, it's that easy, let's do it. I think one of the tactics that I find really valuable to spark that is listening. And it is in a moment of complexity, it's easy to perceive, oh, we don't have time. Like, we need to solve, we need to move, we need to build, we need to cut. That is where our natural inclination goes. But for the leaders who are smart enough to build space into their day to go have deeper conversations with their employees and their customers and their communities. But starting with employees, I think, is the best starting place. Just say, what are you perceiving right now? What is feeling most hard to you? If you had to choose two things for the company to be focusing on right now, like, what would you pick? And like, see what comes back, because like you said, it's deep in our bones. The same as, these instincts are in our bones. The same thing is true with organizations. Like, the answers are in our organizations. You have thousands, if not tens of thousands of smart people working within you who want to succeed. They want to own these problems. Like, that is also in our DNA, is to want to solve and to win and to succeed and be safe together. And there's a lot of that inspiration floating around. So I think what I love most about those exercises is it disarms leaders and it forces you to let go of some of those preconceived notions and offer perspectives that are outside. And I think that can help with that mindset shift. And then there's all sorts of ways about, bringing it to life from there. But I think that's like the most fundamental shift that I would start with.
I absolutely love that. It's a really practical and grounded way to actually start to experience that mindset shift. I would say two things at the kind of team and organizational level. I'm a big fan of the team charter as
Yeah.
well. I think that just sit down together and say like, this is what we're trying to achieve. Of course you'll have your organization's mission, which is like the long term, et cetera. But like,
Yeah.
what does that mean for the next 12 weeks or the next 6 months, or
Yeah.
insert time frame here? But what does that mean in this moment? And what does that mean for your priorities in this moment? And then share that with every team laddering down and have them do that same activity. Because I think that actually forces focus and prioritization and shared ownership and shared purpose. And I think that can really galvanize, especially in a moment of fear. It
Hmm.
can be a really anchoring first step and an anchoring activity. And on a personal level, I would say find a way to get to know your own nervous system and
Mm.
find a way to start coming out of the fight or flight yourselves. I think just like societally right now, we're all, even just as citizens, even outside of work, it's a funny time and we're all experiencing this unsettledness at a pretty deep level. And I think leading from that place, will leave us limited. And I would say in whatever way, getting to know your nervous system, whether that's finding a way to calm down, finding a way to be in nature, etc. There's lots of resources out there. But I think the first question is just to ask yourself, like, how am I actually really doing? How am I feeling in this moment? How am I experiencing the pressures around me? And yeah, what's my kind of inner experience of this? Um, I know in my own life that's made a big difference, and I
That's
think that can
beautiful.
actually really that can also be part of that mindset shift.
100%. Yeah. I couldn't agree more with that.
Yeah. Andy, thank you so much. We'll leave it there for now, even though I'm sure we can have lots more rich conversations, and well, we should plan to do that another time
Would love it.
as well. But it's been such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your work in the world. Thank you for leading this change. It's been really inspiring to connect with you and connect with the vision of the world in which actually we are really thriving amongst the disruption.
Likewise. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. And I'm excited to see what happens. I think like the world of work is going to look so different 3 to 5 years from now. And I'm actually extremely excited to see what it looks like because hopefully a lot of those breakages are resolved and they look better and they're serving not just companies, but people in better, more impactful ways. So I'm excited to see what comes of it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Usha.